When Donna Harvey stepped out of her apartment building on a Tuesday morning and saw a black man standing near the entrance writing notes on a clipboard, she didn't ask his name. She didn't ask who he was there to see. She didn't say good morning. She watched him for 4 minutes from just inside the lobby door. Then she walked out, crossed her arms, and told him he didn't belong there. Tony Norman had owned the building for 11 days. He had spent the previous 3 weeks in closing meetings, signing documents, reviewing inspection reports, and wiring the kind of money that makes a bank officer stand up to shake your hand. He had driven to Clover Street that Tuesday morning to walk the property, take notes on what needed attention first, and introduce himself to anyone he happened to meet. He was dressed in dark slacks and a blue-collar shirt. He had a clipboard, a coffee, and exactly nowhere else he needed to be. He had not been loitering. He had been doing what landlords do on a quiet Tuesday morning when they're looking at something they own. Donna Harvey had lived in Unit 2B for 7 years. In that time, she had grown comfortable with a particular version of how this building worked, and more specifically, who belonged in it and who didn't. She had never seen a black man standing at the entrance with a clipboard, so she made a decision about what that meant before she opened the door. She was wrong about all of it. And in the next several minutes, then the next several days, then the months that followed, that decision would cost her in ways she had not begun to calculate when she pulled out her phone and dialed 911. Before we get into what happened next, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. We want to know where you're tuning in from. And if you believe that owning property should be enough to prove you belong somewhere without a badge, without a debate, without a police car pulling up, like this video and subscribe. Because that's exactly what this story is about. Tony Norman was 44 years old and had spent 19 years building the kind of financial discipline that most people talk about and few people actually execute. He had started as a project coordinator at a mid-sized logistics company in Atlanta, took every overtime shift available for the first 4 years, and lived in a one-bedroom apartment that his colleagues politely described as modest. He drove a used car he had paid cash for, cooked most of his meals at home, and put the difference between what he earned and what he spent into index funds, then into his first small rental property in 2014, then into his second in 2017. By 2019, he had 3 units generating income. By 2023, he had 7. The Clover Street building was his largest acquisition. 6 units, solid bones, undervalued because the previous owner had deferred maintenance for 4 years and priced it to exit quickly. Tony had seen exactly what it was, a problem with a solution attached, and he had moved on it with the focus of a man who had spent nearly 2 decades learning how to recognize that specific combination. He closed on a Thursday. The ink was dry, the wire had cleared, and the building at 14, Clover Street, belonged to Tony Norman before noon. He gave himself the weekend. Then on Tuesday morning, he drove over with his clipboard, his coffee, and a list of priorities he had started building during the inspection phase. The exterior needed attention. 2 of the units had maintenance requests the previous owner had left unaddressed. He wanted to walk the common areas, check the basement, and get a feel for the property now that it was his to manage rather than evaluate. He was not hiding. He was not rushing. He stood near the entrance for several minutes, making notes about the condition of the front facade, the state of the exterior lighting, and a crack in the front step that needed to be addressed before someone turned it into a liability. He had been there approximately 4 minutes when Donna Harvey appeared. She did not come outside the way a person comes outside when they're leaving for work or stepping out for air. She came outside the way a person comes outside when they have already made a decision and are arriving to enforce it. The door opened with purpose. Her arms were crossed before she cleared the threshold. Her eyes went directly to Tony with the focused attention of someone who had been watching from inside and had seen enough. Tony noticed all of this. He had the particular awareness of a black man who has spent a lifetime reading rooms and hallways and lobbies, and the body language of people who have already decided what category to put him in. He recognized the posture. He recognized the expression. He kept his face neutral and his body still. "Hey," Donna Harvey said, not a greeting, a challenge dressed up as one. Tony looked up from his clipboard. What are you doing out here? Taking notes on the property, Tony said. This property, Donna said, making the words carry the full weight of what she meant by them. Yes, Tony said simply. Donna looked at the clipboard, then at Tony, then at the building behind her, and her expression moved through something that landed on certainty. The certainty of a woman who had lived somewhere for 7 years and had developed a strong opinion about what belonged there. You need to leave, she said. I don't know what you're doing here, but you don't live in this building and you're making people uncomfortable. Tony looked at her steadily. People, he said. Me, Donna said without pausing. You're making me uncomfortable, and I'm calling the police. Tony Norman set his coffee down on the front step he had already noted needed repair. He looked at Donna Harvey with the calm expression of a man who understood exactly what was happening and had already decided how he was going to handle it. Go ahead, he said, and he went back to his clipboard. Donna Harvey made the call from 6 feet away. She did not step back inside the building. She did not move down the street for privacy. She stood on the front step of 14 Clover Street, close enough for Tony Norman to hear every word, and she dialed 911 with the deliberate energy of a woman who wanted the call to be witnessed as much as she wanted it answered. Tony kept writing. The dispatcher picked up on the second ring. 911, what's your emergency? Yes, I need to report a suspicious person outside my building. He's been standing here for, she glanced at Tony, at least 20 minutes. He won't leave. He's making me very uncomfortable, and I don't know what he wants. The dispatcher's voice was measured and professional. Has the individual threatened you in any way? A pause. Not directly, but he's just standing there with a clipboard, and he won't tell me what he's doing. Did you ask him? Another pause. Shorter this time. I told him to leave. Ma'am, has he made any threatening gestures or statements toward you? He told me to go ahead and call, which I'm doing. Tony heard that part clearly. He wrote down 2 more notes about the exterior lighting. His handwriting was the same as it had been before the call started. Unhurried. Specific. The dispatcher told Donna Harvey the unit would be there shortly and advised her to stay where she was if she felt safe doing so. Donna said she did. She hung up and positioned herself near the entrance with her arms still crossed, watching Tony the way a person watches something they're certain they're about to be proven right about. They stood like that for 8 minutes. Tony finished his exterior notes, flipped to a new page, and began a rough sketch of the front facade, marking the areas he wanted the contractor to look at first. He was halfway through it when the patrol car turned onto Clover Street. Officer Ray Purcell was 12 years on the force, mid-30s, the kind of officer who had responded to enough neighbor disputes to know that the call and the reality rarely matched each other cleanly. He parked, stepped out, and read the scene in the way experienced officers read scenes, taking in both people simultaneously before committing to a direction. He looked at Donna, arms crossed, stationed near the entrance. He looked at Tony, clipboard in hand, standing at a relaxed distance from a building. He walked toward Tony first. Afternoon, sir. Mind if I ask what brings you out here today? Not at all, Tony said. He closed the clipboard. I'm Tony Norman. I purchased this building 11 days ago. I'm here doing a property walkthrough. Officer Purcell's expression remained neutral. Do you have any documentation showing ownership? In my car, Tony said. Give me 30 seconds. He walked to the black SUV parked directly in front of the building, the car that had been there the entire time, visible from the lobby window, opened the back door, and returned to the folder. Inside, it was the executed deed to 14 Clover Street, registered in the name of Tony Norman, along with the purchase settlement statement and his photo ID. Officer Purcell reviewed each document carefully. He looked at the deed. He looked at the ID. He looked at Tony. Then he turned toward Donna Harvey with the expression of a man who now had a complete picture and needed her to have it too. Ma'am, he said, were you aware that this building recently changed ownership? Donna Harvey's arms came down slowly. No, she said. Her voice had lost the certainty it had been carrying for the last 20 minutes. Nobody told me anything about that. Officer Purcell looked back at Tony. Tony Norman tucked the folder under his arm, picked up his coffee from the front step, and looked at Donna Harvey with an expression that was entirely composed and absolutely final. "Well," Tony said quietly, "now you know." While Officer Purcell sat in his patrol car completing his incident report, and while Donna Harvey stood inside the lobby of a building she had just discovered she did not own, Tony Norman walked the perimeter of 14 Clover Street and continued doing exactly what he had come to do. He checked the rear drainage. He photographed the condition of the back stairwell. He noted the state of the basement entry door and added it to the list of things that needed immediate attention. He was focused. He was methodical. He was unbothered. This was not an accident of personality. It was the result of 19 years of building something in an environment that had not always made it easy, and developing, in the process, the specific kind of steadiness that comes from knowing exactly who you are and exactly what you have built. What Donna Harvey did not know when she crossed her arms and walked out that door was any of the following. She did not know that Tony Norman had bought his first investment property at 25 with money he had saved working double shifts for 3 consecutive years. She did not know that he had spent the better part of 2 decades studying real estate law, contract structure, and property management with the same focus other people apply to hobbies. She did not know that he had read the inspection report on 14 Clover Street 4 times before making his offer, that he had walked the building twice with his contractor before closing, or that he had already identified every maintenance issue in the property before Donna Harvey had any idea he existed. She did not know that the folder in his car, the one Officer Purcell had just examined, was one of 3 copies Tony kept, because 19 years of operating as a black man in spaces that were not always designed to receive him had taught him that documentation was not optional. It was armor. She did not know that 14 Clover Street was the 9th property Tony Norman had acquired, that he managed his portfolio without a management company because he was precise enough to do it himself, that his tenants, across 8 years of landlord experience, had an average tenancy of 4 years because he maintained his properties, answered his calls, and treated the people who lived in his buildings like the clients they were. She did not know any of this because she had not asked a single question. She had looked at a black man standing outside a building with a clipboard and made a complete decision about who he was and what he was doing there, and that decision had led her directly to this moment, standing in a lobby, watching through glass, while the man she had called the police on finished inspecting something that belonged entirely to him. Tony Norman flipped to a new page on his clipboard. He had a lot more building to get through. Donna Harvey spent the rest of that Tuesday telling herself it would amount to nothing. She had made a call. The officer had come, looked at some papers, and left. Tony Norman had eventually gotten back in his black SUV and driven away. The street had gone quiet again. The building had returned to the version of itself she was comfortable with. She told herself the paperwork was probably standard, that these things could be contested, that someone from the previous owner's office would likely reach out and explain that there had been a misunderstanding and that everything would return to the way it had been before a black man with a clipboard had appeared outside her door on a Tuesday morning. She was still telling herself this 4 days later when the envelope arrived. It was slid under the door of Unit 2B on a Saturday morning. A clean white envelope with her name written on the front in clear, precise handwriting. No stumps. No return address. Hand-delivered. Inside was a single folded letter on plain white paper. Professional formatting. No unnecessary language. It introduced Tony Norman as the new owner of 14 Clover Street, effective as of the date of closing 11 days prior. It outlined, briefly and clearly, his plans for the building, beginning with a full maintenance review of all 6 units, starting the following week. It noted that all rent payments previously directed to the former owner were now to be directed to a new account, details enclosed. It stated that he would be conducting individual tenant introductions over the coming 2 weeks, and that he looked forward to meeting everyone properly. The final paragraph was short. It noted, that as part of his ownership transition, he had become aware of an incident on the property on Tuesday morning involving a call to law enforcement. It stated, in plain language, that he was in the process of reviewing his options regarding that incident, and that his attorney had been made aware of the situation. It was signed, Tony Norman, owner, 14 Clover Street. Donna Harvey read the letter twice at her kitchen table. Then she set it down and sat very still for a long time. The thing about the letter was not its tone. The tone was measured and professional, the same tone Tony had used on the front step. What sat heavily on Donna in that kitchen on that Saturday morning was the clarity of it. There was no ambiguity to hide inside of. There was no version of events to rearrange. There was only the plain architecture of what had happened, laid out by the man it had happened to, who had documented it, retained an attorney, and was now her landlord. Her landlord. The man she had called the police on 11 days after he had signed the deed to the building she lived in was now the person responsible for renewing her lease. Donna Harvey picked up the letter and read a third time. Tony Norman began his tenant introductions the following Monday morning. He started on the third floor and worked his way down. He knocked on each door with the same energy he had brought to the front step the week before, unhurried, direct, prepared. He carried his clipboard, a printed sheet with his contact information and the new payment details, and the same folder that had already survived one police inspection and was now serving a quieter but equally important purpose. Unit 3A opened immediately. Marcus and Priya Okonkwo, late 30s, both teachers, had lived in the building for 3 years. Marcus shook Tony's hand before Tony had finished introducing himself. Priya asked 2 specific questions about the maintenance timeline and seemed satisfied with both answers. They took the contact sheet, said they appreciated him coming in person, and told him they were glad someone was finally going to look at the hallway lighting on the 3rd floor, which had been flickering for 6 months. Tony wrote it down. Unit 3B took longer to answer. An older woman named Gloria Fitch, mid-70s, recently widowed, who examined Tony's documentation carefully through reading glasses before opening the door fully. She had questions about whether the rent was going up and whether he was planning to renovate in ways that would displace anyone. Tony answered both questions directly and honestly. No immediate rent increase. Renovations limited to maintenance and safety. He handed her his card and told her to call him personally if anything in her unit needed attention. Gloria Fitch looked at the card for a moment, then at Tony, and said the boiler made a sound every morning at 5 a.m. that she had reported 4 times without result. Tony wrote it down. Unit 2, it was a young couple who had moved in 8 months earlier and were visibly relieved that someone with a plan was now in charge of the building. They listed 3 unaddressed maintenance issues in under 2 minutes. Tony wrote all 3 down without interrupting. Then he knocked on the door of Unit 2B. There was a long pause before it opened. Donna Harvey looked different from the woman who had stood on the front step with her arms crossed and her phone already dialing. She was smaller somehow. The certainty that had been carrying her posture a week earlier had been replaced by something more careful. She was wearing weekend clothes. She had not been expecting him this early. "Ms. Harvey," Tony said. "Tony Norman. I wanted to introduce myself properly." Donna Harvey said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "I know who you are." "I know you do," Tony said. He handed her the contact sheet. "I wanted to give you this in person. Payment details, my direct line, maintenance request process." Donna took it without looking at it. Her eyes stayed on Tony. "I also wanted you to know," Tony continued, his voice carrying the same measured steadiness it had carried on the front step, "that I intend to run this building professionally and fairly. Every tenant gets the same standard of care. That includes you." Donna Harvey looked at the contact sheet in her hand. Something moved across her face that was difficult to name precisely. Not quite guilt, not quite relief, something between them that hadn't finished becoming either one yet. "About last week," she started. Tony held up one hand. Not a dismissal, a pause. "My attorney is handling last week," he said simply. "What I'm here for this morning is the building." Donna closed her mouth. Is there anything in your unit that needs attention? Tony asked. Anything that was reported and not addressed under the previous owner? A long pause. The kitchen faucet, Donna said quietly. It's been dripping for 4 months. Tony Norman wrote it down. The same clipboard, the same handwriting, the same unhurried precision he had been applying since the moment he stepped out of his car on a Tuesday morning and began inspecting something that belonged entirely to him. I'll have someone look at it this week, he said. He thanked her for her time, turned, and knocked on the door of Unit 2C. He had a building to run. Tony Norman had called his attorney. The same evening Officer Purcell had driven away from 14 Clover Street. Not out of panic, not out of anger, out of the same methodical precision that had governed every significant decision he had made in 19 years. He had sat in his car outside the building for 10 minutes after finishing his walkthrough, reviewed his notes, and then made the call the way a man makes a call when he already knows what the situation requires and is simply moving to the next step. His attorney was a woman named Sandra Okafor, 41 years old, 12 years in practice, specializing in civil rights and real estate law, a combination that Tony had specifically sought out when he began expanding his portfolio 3 years earlier, because he understood that the two areas of law had a way of intersecting in his life with a frequency that made having someone fluent in both a practical necessity rather than a precaution. Tony told her what had happened, calmly and in sequence. The clipboard, the front step, Donna Arve, the call, Officer Purcell, the documents, the resolution. Sandra Okafor listened without interrupting. When Tony finished, she asked 4 questions. Had the 911 call been recorded? Yes. All 911 calls are recorded by default. Had Officer Purcell filed an incident report? Yes. Tony had watched him complete it from the front step. Was there any building security camera coverage of the entrance? Tony checked his notes. Yes. The previous owner had installed a camera above the front entrance that was still active. The 4th question was the one that mattered most. Did she state her reason for calling? Tony thought back to standing on the front step, clipboard in hand, listening to Donna Harvey describe a suspicious person to a 911 dispatcher while standing close enough for him to hear every word. She said I was making her uncomfortable, Tony said. She said I'd been standing there for 20 minutes, which wasn't accurate. She said I wouldn't tell her what I was doing, which also wasn't accurate. I told her I was taking notes on the property. Did she mention race? Not to the dispatcher, Tony said. To me, her body language said everything that her words didn't. Sandra Okafor said she would file a formal request for the 911 recording and the incident report within the week. She also advised Tony to request the entrance camera footage from the building's security system immediately, before anything was overwritten. Tony had already sent that request before the call ended. What Sandra Okafor began building over the following 2 weeks was not a complicated case. It was, in her words during their second meeting, one of the cleaner fact patterns she had worked with. The 911 recording captured Donna Harvey describing a suspicious black man who had done nothing threatening, nothing illegal, and nothing beyond standing outside a building that the recording itself could not identify as his or not his. The incident report filed by Officer Purcell documented that Tony had produced valid ownership documentation that was verified on the scene. The entrance camera footage showed Tony arriving, parking directly in front of the building, and spending approximately 4 minutes making notes near the entrance before Donna Harvey emerged. For minutes. Not 20. Not loitering. Not suspicious. For minutes of a landlord doing a landlord's job in front of a building he owned. The footage also showed something Sandra Okafor noted specifically in her case file. It showed the angle from the lobby window, the window behind which Donna Harvey had clearly been standing and watching before she came outside. It showed that from that window, Tony's black SUV was entirely visible. The car he had driven to his own building, parked directly in front of it. She had seen the car. She had watched him for 4 minutes, and she had still made the call. Sandra Okafor submitted the formal complaint to the city's civil rights office on a Thursday morning. She filed the civil suit against Donna Harvey that same afternoon. Tony Norman was in a contractor meeting when both filings went through. He had a building to renovate. Sandra Okafor had not expected the former tenants. She had built the case on 4 pillars: the 911 recording, the incident report, the entrance camera footage, and a documented 4-minute timeline. It was already a strong foundation. Clean facts, clear sequence, no ambiguity to hide inside of. Then the former tenants started calling. It began with a woman named Celeste Boateng, who had lived in Unit 3B for 2 years before moving out 14 months earlier. She had seen the local news brief about the incident at 14 Clover Street and called Sandra Okafor's office on a Wednesday afternoon. She had a story she wanted to tell. Then came a man named Derek Simmons who had lived in Unit 2A for 11 months and left because staying had started to feel like a daily negotiation with his own sense of belonging. Then a young woman named Aisha Trimble, who had lived in Unit 1B for 7 months and departed owing a forwarding address she had deliberately not shared with building management. All 3 of them were black. All 3 of them had lived at 14 Clover Street while Donna Harvey was living in Unit 2B. And all 3 of them had a version of the same story. Celeste Boateng described being followed to the building entrance on 4 separate occasions by Donna Harvey, who had demanded to see her key before allowing her to enter a building she paid rent to live in. Derek Simmons described a building management complaint filed against him for noise on a night he had 3 people verify he was not home. Aisha Trimble described finding a note slid under her door, informing her that the other residents found her cooking smells disruptive and asking her to be more considerate of the people around her. None of them had filed formal complaints. All 3 of them said the same thing when Sandra asked why. They didn't think it would change anything. Sandra Okafor added 3 witness declarations to the civil case file and called Tony to brief him on the development. Tony listened without surprise. He had the particular understanding of a man who knew that what happened to him on a Tuesday morning was rarely an isolated incident. There was almost always the visible edge of something that had been operating beneath the surface for much longer. What Donna Harvey had done to Tony Norman on the front step had taken 20 minutes to unfold and 4 minutes of footage to document. What she had apparently been doing to the building for years had taken 3 phone calls to Sandra Okafor's office to begin to surface. And those were just the people who had seen the news brief. Those were just the people who had called. Sandra Okafor noted in her case file that she expected more. She was right. The civil trial date was set for a Thursday morning 6 weeks after Sandra Okafor filed the complaint. Donna Harvey had retained an attorney named Paul Gessel, a mid-50s litigator who had spent the better part of his career handling neighbor disputes and property disagreements, and who had taken Donna's case with the confidence of a man who had not yet reviewed the full evidence file. By the time he had requested 2 separate meetings with Donna in 1 week, and had emerged from both of them with the careful expression of an attorney who has seen the facts and is now managing expectations rather than building strategy. The evidence against Donna Harvey did not have gaps. The 911 recording played in the courtroom on the first morning and established, in Donna Harvey's own voice, that she had called law enforcement to report a black man who had not threatened her, had not approached her aggressively, had not done anything she could point to beyond standing outside a building and declining to leave when she told him to. The dispatcher's questions were methodical and Donna's answers were precise in the way that precision becomes a liability. She had been specific enough to document exactly what she had and had not observed, and what she had observed was a black man with a clipboard doing nothing. The entrance camera footage was presented next. For minutes and 11 seconds of Tony Norman arriving, parking, stepping out of his vehicle, and making notes near the front entrance of a building the deed confirmed he owned. Sandra Okafor let it play in full without commentary, because it required none. The jury watched 4 minutes and 11 seconds of a man doing unremarkable, completely ordinary landlord work, and then watched the door open and Donna Harvey emerge with her arms already crossed. The timeline was entered into evidence. Tony had arrived at 9:42 a.m. Donna Harvey had called 911 at 9:46 a.m. for minutes and 11 seconds between his arrival and her call. Not 20 minutes. Not loitering. Not suspicious behavior accumulating over time into genuine concern. For minutes. Paul Gessel's cross-examination attempted to establish that Donna Harvey had genuinely feared for her safety and had acted out of reasonable concern for the building's security. It was a defensible argument in the abstract and an indefensible one against the footage. A woman who fears for her safety does not stand 6 feet from the source of that fear, delivering her 911 call at audible volume. A woman who fears for her safety does not remain on the front step for the duration of the call. The footage showed exactly where Donna Harvey had stood and exactly how she had carried herself throughout, and reasonable fear was not the word any objective observer would reach for. The 3 former tenants testified on the second day. Celeste Boateng described being stopped at the entrance of her own building and demanded to produce her key before Donna Harvey would allow her pass. She described it happening 4 times across 2 years with a matter-of-fact steadiness that landed harder than anger would have. Derek Simmons described the noise complaint filed against him on a night 3 people confirmed he was absent from the building. He brought the confirmation texts. Aisha Trimble read the note that had been slid under her door about her cooking smells, which she had kept in an envelope in a drawer for 14 months because she hadn't known what else to do with it. All 3 of them were composed. All 3 of them were precise. All 3 of them described looking at what had happened to Tony Norman on that Tuesday morning and recognizing something they had already lived. Donna Harvey's attorney requested a brief recess after Aisha Trimble's testimony. He used it to approach Sandra Okafor about settlement. Sandra relayed the conversation to Tony during the break. Tony said no. He said it the way he said most things, quietly, without drama, with the finality of a man who had already decided. He had not brought this case to resolve it in a hallway outside a courtroom. He had brought it because 3 people who had lived in his building before he owned it had been treated as trespassers in their own homes and had left because no one had made it stop. He was making it stop. The jury deliberated for 5 hours. They returned a verdict in Tony Norman's favor on all counts. Racial discrimination, harassment, filing a false police report motivated by racial bias. Donna Harvey was ordered to pay $180,000 in damages. She sat at the defense table and said nothing when the verdict was read. Paul Gessel leaned over and said something close to her ear. She shook her head once without looking at him. There was nothing left to strategize. The verdict was the beginning of the consequences, not the end of them. Donna Harvey walked out of the courtroom on a Thursday afternoon with a $180,000 judgment attached to her name, an attorney she could no longer afford to retain, and a story that had spent the previous 3 weeks accumulating the kind of public attention that does not dissipate after a gavel comes down. She had driven to that courthouse as a tenant with a legal dispute. She drove away from it as a woman whose name was now permanently attached to a 911 recording that several local news outlets had already aired and that 2 national platforms had picked up by the end of the first trial day. The recording did not stop circulating after the verdict. It accelerated. Within 48 hours of the jury's decision, Donna Harvey's name had been connected to her employer, a regional property management company called Hargrove Associates, where she had worked as a leasing consultant for 6 years. The connection was made publicly on social media by people who had listened to the 911 recording and spent approximately 11 minutes researching the woman behind the voice. Hargrove Associates issued a statement 2 days after the verdict. It cited conduct incompatible with company values and the particular irony, noted plainly in the statement, without softening, that a leasing consultant whose professional responsibility was to connect people with housing had been found liable for racially discriminating against a black property owner. The termination was effective immediately. No evidence. 6 years of employment concluded in a paragraph. Donna Harvey had managed other people's rental applications for 6 years. She was now unemployed, carrying a $180,000 civil judgment, and living in a building owned by the man she had called the police on. The least consequence arrived 4 weeks after the verdict. Tony Norman had said nothing publicly about what he intended to do regarding Donna Harvey's tenancy at 14 Clover Street. He had not given interviews. He had not posted statements. He had continued managing the building with the same methodical focus he had applied since the day he closed. The faucet in Unit 2B had been repaired within the week he promised. The hallway lighting on the 3rd floor had been replaced. The front step crack had been addressed by a contractor the 2nd week of his ownership. He had run the building the way he said he would. Professionally. Fairly. Every tenant the same standard of care. When the lease termination notice arrived under the door of Unit 2B, it was written in the same clean, precise format as the first letter Donna Harvey had received from Tony Norman. It cited a specific clause in the building's conduct policy, sustained behavior that created a hostile environment for other residents and guests of the property. It referenced the civil court verdict. It referenced the 3 witness testimonies from former tenants. It gave Donna Harvey 60 days to vacate Unit 2B, the apartment she had lived in for 7 years and spent 7 years treating as something she had the right to police on behalf of. She was out in 43 days. She left on a Wednesday morning with a moving truck she had arranged herself and no audience except the entrance camera above the front door. The same camera whose footage had played in a courtroom and helped end her case before her attorney had found his footing. The same entrance she had stood in front of on a Tuesday morning, arms crossed, phone already dialing, certain about what she was seeing and entirely wrong about all of it. The hallway of 14 Clover Street was quiet after she left. The building filled that quiet quickly. Tony had a waiting list for Unit 2B within 6 days of posting it. He screened applicants the way he screened all applicants: income verification, references, rental history. The unit was rented to a young woman named Brianna Cole, 29 years old, a pediatric nurse starting a new position at a hospital 4 blocks away. She moved in on a Saturday morning with 2 friends, helping carry boxes and a houseplant she had owned for 3 years and transported very carefully up the stairs. Tony Norman stopped by the building that Saturday to check on a contractor completing work in the basement. He saw Brianna Cole's friends carrying boxes through the entrance and held the door open for them. One of them thanked him. He said it was no problem. He went downstairs to check on the contractor, made 3 notes on his clipboard, and drove to his next property. He had 6 other buildings that needed attention. 5 years after the morning, he stood on the front step of 14 Clover Street with a clipboard and a coffee. Tony Norman owned 14 properties. Not because of what had happened with Donna Harvey. Not because the verdict had unlocked something or the public attention had opened doors. The 14 properties were the result of the same 19 years of discipline and precision and unglamorous consistency that had produced the first 13. Tony Norman had not needed a Tuesday morning confrontation to validate his trajectory. He had been building long before anyone was watching, and he continued building after the cameras moved on. But what happened at 14 Clover Street did produce something beyond the verdict and the consequences and the 911 recording that continued circulating in fair housing training programs and civil rights seminars 2 years after it had first aired. It produced a standard. Tony had used his platform during the brief period of public attention. He had given 2 interviews, both local, both focused on systemic issues rather than personal grievance, to say something he had been thinking about long before Donna Harvey walked out of a lobby door with her arms crossed. He had said that the problem was not only what happened on front steps. The problem was what happened before front steps and after them and in the buildings and systems that surrounded them. He had said that the 3 former tenants who testified in his case had each tried to tell someone what was happening and had not been heard, and that the absence of consequences for sustained harassment was itself a form of permission. He had said these things calmly, without performance, in the same measured voice he had used in every other context, And people had listened because the credibility of a man who had kept his composure through a 911 call and a near arrest and a courtroom and had still come out the other side, running a growing real estate portfolio, was difficult to dismiss. Sandra Okafor had used the case in 3 subsequent fair housing complaints. She cited the documented pattern of harassment, the inadequate response of building management under the previous owner, and the civil court verdict as precedent for taking seriously the sustained, low-level racial hostility that rarely produced dramatic footage, but consistently produced black tenants who left buildings they had every right to remain in. The case had a name in her office now. She didn't use it publicly, but her staff knew what it meant when someone said the Clover Street Standard. Tony had also done something quieter that received no coverage and required no attorney. In the 18 months following the verdict, he had reached out personally to Celeste Boateng, Derek Simmons, and Aisha Trimble, the 3 former tenants who had testified. He had not offered them apartments. He had not made grand gestures. He had called each of them, thanked them for their testimony, and asked how they were doing with the genuine interest of a man who understood that their willingness to come forward had mattered and that matching deserved acknowledgement. Celeste Boateng had found a good building in a different neighborhood. Derek Simmons had moved to a different city entirely and was doing well. Aisha Trimble was still in Houston, still renting, still carrying the low-grade vigilance of a woman who had learned that the space between her front door and the lobby could contain more than she should have to navigate. Tony had listened to all 3 of them the way he listened to everything, without interruption, without rushing to fill the silence, with the focused attention of a man who understood that some things needed to be heard more than they needed to be responded to. He had written nothing on his clipboard during those calls. 5 years on, 14, Clover Street was a well-maintained building with a waiting list and a boiler that no longer made sounds at 5 a.m. because Tony Norman had replaced it in his 2nd year of ownership. Gloria Fitch in Unit 3B had renewed her lease 3 times. She had Tony's direct number saved in her phone under a name she had chosen herself. She called it Good Landlord. The entrance camera at 14 Clover Street was replaced in Tony Norman's 2nd year of ownership. The old one had been adequate. It had done its job, captured what it needed to capture, and delivered footage that had played in a courtroom and helped establish the truth of a Tuesday morning that Donna Harvey had been counting on no one being able to verify. But adequate was not the standard Tony applied to things he owned. And so the old camera came down and a better one went up, covering a wider angle, storing footage for longer, recording in higher resolution the ordinary and unremarkable daily life of a building that had returned to being exactly what a building should be. A place where people came home. Marcus and Priya Okonkwo in Unit 3, they had a daughter now. 18 months old, carried through the front entrance in a car seat on the day they brought her home from the hospital, the camera above the door recording the moment without ceremony, because cameras do not know which moments are significant and which are ordinary, and in a well-run building the distinction matters less than it does in buildings where people have to prove they belong. Gloria Fitch in Unit 3B had outlasted everyone's expectations, including her own. She was 78 now and had recently informed Tony during his quarterly walkthrough that she intended to renew her lease indefinitely and that he should plan accordingly. Tony had written it down on his clipboard and told her he would make a note. Brianna Cole in Unit 2B had lived in the apartment for 4 years. She had the pediatric nurse's particular quality of moving through difficult spaces with professional calm, and she had become, without anyone formally designating her as such, the person other tenants called when they needed someone steady. Her houseplant, the one she had transported carefully up the stairs on moving day, had grown large enough to require its own corner of the living room. The building had rhythm now. The particular rhythm of a place that is maintained and managed and taken seriously, where the lights work and the boiler runs quietly and the front step does not have a crack in it, because the crack was addressed in the 2nd week of new ownership and has not returned because the person responsible for it checks. Tony Norman walked through 14 Clover Street on the first Tuesday of every month. He used the same clipboard, the same methodical top-to-bottom sequence. The same unhurried attention he had brought to the building on the morning a woman had watched him from a lobby window for 4 minutes and decided she knew everything she needed to know about who he was and what he was doing there. The hallway looked the same as it always had. Painted walls, overhead lights, the camera above the entrance doing its quiet work. It remembered everything. Tony Norman turned the page on his clipboard and kept walking. Donna Harvey moved into a smaller apartment on the other side of Houston 43 days after the lease termination notice arrived under her door. It was a one-bedroom on the second floor of a building managed by a company she had found through a listing site. The application process had taken longer than she expected. The $180,000 civil judgment on her record had required explanation. The background check had surfaced the verdict. The leasing office had asked for a letter of explanation, which her new attorney, a different one, retained at a reduced rate for the limited purpose of navigating her post-trial obligations, had helped her draft in language that was careful and minimal and true only in the narrowest technical sense. She got the apartment, but it had taken 3 rejections before she did. There was a specific irony in this that no one stated publicly, but that existed regardless of whether anyone named it. Donna Harvey had spent 6 years as a leasing consultant deciding who was suitable for housing. She had reviewed applications, conducted screenings, made recommendations about who belonged in which building and under what conditions. She had done this professionally, with the authority of someone whose judgment the industry had trusted and compensated. She now understood, from the other side of that process, what it felt like to have a file that complicated your right to come home. Her professional life did not recover quickly. The termination from Hargrove Associates had been public enough and specific enough that the property management industry in Houston, which was smaller and more interconnected than it appeared from the outside, had absorbed the information before she began sending applications. 2 interviews were canceled after the first round. One offer was rescinded 4 days after it was extended, with a brief email citing a change in hiring needs that fooled no one. She found work eventually in a different industry entirely. Administrative coordination for a mid-sized logistics company. Steady, unremarkable, entirely removed from the world of leasing and tenancy and the particular authority that came with deciding who belonged where. She did not give interviews. She did not make public statements. She maintained, in the years following the trial, the low profile of a woman who understood that the 911 recording was not going to disappear and that every public statement she made would be heard against the backdrop of her own voice telling a dispatcher that a black man didn't belong somewhere he owned. The recording never stopped circulating. It never would. Somewhere across Houston, in a building on Clover Street with a new camera above the entrance and a boiler that ran quietly through the night, the hallway that had witnessed everything continued its ordinary work. Lights on, doors opening, people coming home without having to explain themselves to anyone. That was what a building was supposed to be. Donna Harvey had spent 7 years in one and never understood that until she no longer lived there. Tony Norman had never intended to become a case study. He had intended to walk through a building he owned on a Tuesday morning, make notes on what needed attention, and drive to his next property. The clipboard was a working tool, not a symbol. The folder in his car was documentation, not a statement. He had not arrived at 14 Clover Street to prove anything to anyone. He had arrived because he owned the building, and ownership came with responsibility, and responsibility required showing up. But what happened on that front step had produced something beyond the verdict and beyond the consequences delivered to Donna Harvey and beyond the 911 recording that continued circulating in training programs and seminars and university civil rights curricula 18 months after the trial ended. It had produced conversation that became policy. Sandra Okafor had testified before the Houston City Housing Committee 8 months after the verdict, citing the Clover Street case as a specific example of systemic failures that a single civil verdict could not fully address. She had outlined 3 gaps. The absence of any formal mechanism for tracking repeated harassment complaints against specific tenants across building management companies. The lack of mandatory response timelines for harassment complaints filed by residents. And the absence of any consequence for filing racially motivated 911 calls that were demonstrably false at the time they were made. The committee had listened. And then, with the particular slowness of institutional processes that are nevertheless occasionally capable of movement, it had acted. 18 months after Sandra Okafor's testimony, the city of Houston implemented 3 specific measures. The first established a centralized harassment complaint database accessible to all licensed property management companies, requiring mandatory reporting of substantiated harassment complaints and automatic review triggers when complaints against a single resident exceeded 2 in any 12-month period. The second mandated a 15-day response requirement for all filed harassment complaints in managed residential properties, with independent review for any complaint dismissed without investigation. The third created a formal civil penalty structure for 911 calls found by a court to be motivated by racial bias, a direct legislative response to exactly what Donna Harvey had done on a Tuesday morning and exactly what the city's existing framework had lacked the tools to address before it happened. Tony Norman attended the committee session where the measures were formally adopted. He sat in the third row. He did not speak. He had said what he needed to say in 2 local interviews and in a courtroom through Sandra Okafor's presentation of 4 minutes and 11 seconds of footage. He listened to the vote, noted the outcome, and left the building with his clipboard under his arm. He had a property inspection that afternoon. 3 other cities cited the Houston measures within the following year as models for their own housing reform proposals. Sandra Okafor fielded calls from 2 of them. She referred them to the case file. It had everything they needed. On a Tuesday morning 5 years after the first one, Tony Norman pulled up to 14 Clover Street in the same black SUV, parked in the same spot directly in front of the building, and stepped out with the same clipboard. The coffee was the same too. He had never seen a reason to change it. The front step was solid beneath his feet. No crack, no liability, no deferred maintenance waiting to become someone else's problem. The exterior lighting worked. The camera above the entrance recorded his arrival with the same quiet efficiency. It recorded everything. The teachers from 3 leaving for work, Gloria Fitch collecting her mail, Brianna Cole returning from a night shift at the hospital with the particular walk of someone who has been on their feet for 12 hours and is 30 seconds from their own couch. Tony stood at the entrance for a moment before going in. Not because he was making notes. Not because he was checking anything specific. He stood there the way a person stands in front of something they built carefully over a long time and allows themselves, briefly, to see it whole before returning to the work of maintaining it. The building looked back at him the way buildings do, indifferent to significance, occupied with the ordinary business of housing people who had places to be and things to carry and doors that opened when they used their keys. He went inside. The walkthrough took 40 minutes. Everything was in order. The boiler ran without sound. The hallway lights on the 3rd floor, replaced in his first month of ownership, had never flickered again. The common areas were clean. The maintenance log showed 2 requests in the previous quarter, both addressed within the week they were filed. He stopped outside Unit 2B on his way back down. Not for long. Just a moment. Brianna Cole was at work. The door was closed. The hallway was quiet. He did not think about Donna Harvey standing in this hallway with her arms crossed. He did not think about the 911 call, or the officer, or the courtroom, or the recording that still circulated in training programs across 4 states. He had made his peace with all of it in the methodical way. He made peace with everything by doing the next thing and the thing after that, until the distance between now and then became long enough to stop measuring. He thought about the faucet he had repaired in the first week, the boiler in the second year, the camera he had replaced because adequate was not his standard. He thought about 14 properties and a waiting list and Gloria Fitch's phone contact that said, "Good landlord." Tony Norman turned the page on his clipboard, and walked toward the exit. The hallway was just a hallway now. Quiet, well lit, belonging to everyone who lived there. That was enough. Tony Norman never needed a badge. He needed a deed. He had one. He showed it to an officer on a front step on a Tuesday morning, and it should have been enough. The same way it would have been enough for anyone else standing outside a building they owned with documentation in hand and nowhere else they needed to be. It was not enough. Not that morning. Not until the badge wallet came out and reordered the power in the hallway in a way that a deed, apparently, had not been sufficient to do on its own. But here is what the story of 14 Clover Street actually proved. Underneath the verdict and the recording and the consequences that arrived in waves across the months that followed. It proved that documentation matters. Not because it guarantees you will be believed, but because it guarantees the truth exists in a form that cannot be argued with later. Tony Norman had a deed. He had a folder. He had 3 copies of everything because 19 years of operating in spaces that were not always designed to receive him had taught him that preparation was not paranoia. It was protection. It proved that calm is power. Every moment, Tony Norman chose steadiness over reaction. On the front step, in the hallway, in Sandra Okafor's office, in the courtroom, in the building on every first Tuesday of every month, he was demonstrating something that no amount of noise could match. Composure in the face of injustice is not passivity. It is the most precise form of authority a person can carry. It proved that patterns only stop when someone makes them stop. Celeste Boateng, Derek Simmons, and Aisha Trimble had each tried to tell someone. Each of them had left because the consequences never came. Tony Norman made the consequences come. Not out of personal vengeance, but out of the clear-eyed understanding that silence protects the wrong people and accountability protects everyone else. And it proved that what you build, when you build it with discipline and precision and the specific patience of someone who has decided that no obstacle is permanent, eventually becomes something that outlasts every person who tried to tell you that you didn't belong there. 14. Clover Street is a well-run building on a quiet street in Houston. The lights work. The boiler runs. The tenants renew their leases because coming home feels like exactly that. Tony Norman's clipboard is on his passenger seat right now, moving toward whatever building needs his attention next. If this story showed you that ownership is not just financial, that it is the right to stand in front of something you built without explaining yourself to anyone, share it with someone who needs to hear that today. What would have happened if Tony Norman hadn't had that folder? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you believe a deed should be enough, subscribe. Because we are not done telling stories where the truth shows up with documentation and changes everything.